So, Joel, tell us what you do. Tell us how you do it.
Sure. All right. Hello. Thanks for having me. And it's been really looking forward to hang out with you guys and chat about design and policy. So, as stated, my name is Joel Ferris, and I work for the Mayor's Office of Policy and Innovation. I work on a team called the Innovation Team. We're a team of 6 people that is actually funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work that they're doing in the public sector, but Bloomberg, as a previous mayor, really believes in mayors and the role of mayors in really shaping policy and the future of urban space in cities and culture and society at large. So they've poured a lot of money into equipping mayoral offices with design and innovation capacity. So that's what I do. My background is in design strategy and innovation and applied research. So I actually studied formally philosophy of religion and theology in school. So I learned everything on the job in the trenches. And so previously, before joining the mayor's office, I worked for a global architecture firm called MBBJ. I don't know if you've seen the Amazon globes, but we designed those, as well as a few other buildings in town. Before that, I was a consultant with a business partner. We worked consulting startups on growth and innovation, product development, so on and so forth. So that's a little bit about me. Being in the mayor's office has been really interesting. I've been there for about a year now. This is my first stint in the public sector. And being in this new environment has raised a lot of new questions. And so one of those big questions is the question that you guys are asking in this class, right? Which is essentially, how do ideas become policy? How do ideas turn into something that is legislative or law or otherwise? Now, I'm not an expert in policy. I'm not an expert in law, legislation, this realm. This is like totally outside of my ballpark. So I'm going to do my best, based on my very limited experience, to speak to these issues in this intersection. I've been learning a lot, and so a lot of what I want to do tonight is just kind of share with you some of the things I've been thinking about and some of the things that I've been learning about, and hopefully explore a little bit of the intersection of design and this question of how do ideas become policy. But what I'm really interested in is actually the idea of ideas more than anything. The how do ideas become policy, again, is very much a process question that you could educate me on. That's something that I'm not an expert in. But what I'm really interested in is not so much the how, but really the physiology of ideas, right? This sense that, are there good ideas that are better than other ideas? How do you find good ideas? How do you find great ideas? What ideas are actually better for policy than other ideas? Why are they better, right? What makes that difference? And so, just to create a bit of a visual, this is a bad idea, okay? This is a centipede. And the reason that this is a bad idea is because it doesn't become anything. It's really it just is what it is. And it doesn't have potential to actually become something other than what it is. Whereas, this is a good idea, okay? This is a caterpillar. And the reason this is a good idea is because it can become this, right? All right, so we're all tracking with that, a little visual, okay. So I think visually this helps me. Now I can think that we have centipedes and we have caterpillars, okay? So we have good ideas and we've got bad ideas. And so like I said, I'm interested in what are these ideas? What are caterpillar ideas? What are the ideas that have potential? And how do we find those ideas? How do we create butterflies, okay? Now often when we begin to think about the abstract and the esoteric, we can get a little lofty. So we're just going to touch on some of these issues and ideas. I'm going to use the word ideas a lot. Side note too, I'm going to ask a lot of questions that I'm not going to resolve and answer. So if you hear me ask questions that I don't answer, I hope that becomes a seed of inquiry for you that then you can follow at a later time. Anyways, so when I'm thinking about ideas, when I'm thinking about ideas that are good ideas, when I'm thinking about caterpillar ideas, I try, and as I'm thinking through this, I went really to the most basic thing, what's the foundation of all of this, right? And so for me, this idea of justice came up. And I would imagine that all of you are here and all of you are studying policy for some reason in this process of policy, because there's something about justice at a really fundamental level, and whether you've been able to put your finger on it or identify it or even articulate it, that moves you, right? That has been fuel for you in some way. And so There's this great quote by one of my favorite philosophers named Jacques Derrida. He's the father of deconstruction. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but you should be if you're not. And he says, justice in itself does not exist, but it is something we demand and something that is demanded of us. Justice is what we call for and something that calls on us, something that we solicit and something by which we are solicited. And so what he's saying is that justice is this thing that doesn't have actually much agency. It doesn't have innate power. And that it's actually up to people who create policy and who identify justice and put capsules around justice that are doing this kind of making justice manifest in the world. And so there's this idea that when you create policy, you're actually doing very existential work, because you're responding to this call, you're responding to this pull, you're responding to this solicitation, right? And what you're doing is you're actually, in developing policy, you're responding to this call of justice, and then you're ushering in justice in some sort of tangible reality, right? So there's another philosopher who calls this the oughtness, Peter Rollins. He calls this the oughtness of the world, right? That there's a way things ought to be, and they aren't that way right now. And so in responding to that tension, you have to go and find the oughtness and make it present in reality. So, just too many keywords up here. So the act of creating new policy is an act of describing what the future will be like in some sense, right? And so this is very existential work. And what's really fascinating about this is that designers actually have the same job. So a couple things about designers. Designers, this is design theorist John Chris Jones, says designers are forever bound to treat as real that which exists only in an imagined future, right? Because a designer is designing something that doesn't exist yet. They're creating a new thing, right? Secondly, this is Jessica Helfand, the designer and author. She says, designers are by their very nature emissaries of that which faces outward, propagators seeding the future. So designers and people who are creative are doing the same kind of existential work. They're being pulled by something, or they're responding to something, or they're being pushed and motivated by something that is yet to exist. And there's a sense that it could exist, and if it did exist, that it could actually improve and elevate the quality of human life in some degree. So there actually is quite a bit, at a philosophical level, a ton of overlap between people who create policy and designers. Okay, so now back to this idea, or the question of how do ideas become law, become policy. If we take into account this idea of justice, if we take into account the existential nature of creating policy, if we take into account design at a philosophical level, maybe there's a way to reframe this question that is a bit more relevant to design and this overlap. And maybe that question is, how is justice designed? So as policymakers and designers have a similar purpose, maybe we need to share our tools. Maybe we need to actually think about the ways that policymakers and designers are ushering in this oughtness. And if we can share those tools, if those tools can overlap, then maybe we can actually create a more effectively equitable and prosperous environment for everyone. So, we've talked about design, but let's actually take a step back and define design. So I define design as intentional decision making. At a very fundamental level, this is design to me. Now, how many of you in here this morning asked somebody else to pick out your outfit for you? No one. Okay, so that means you all picked out your outfit, right? So you designed what you were going to wear today. You designed an outfit. I heard there might be somebody's drawing on the chalkboard or some presentations later. So maybe you designed a presentation, right? Maybe you've had a project in your program that you've had to actually develop some sort of policy or a program, right? So you've done sense of design. You've made intentional decisions that have led to some sort of outcome. And that outcome can be what you wear on any given day, how do you get to your job and what bus you take, to even the act of writing, right? You're designing a document of a sort. When you shift margins, right? It's all design, it's intentional decision making. But let's take a step back. We're going to go back to the 1947. Walter Gropius says the term design broadly embraces the whole orbit of man-made visible surroundings, from simple everyday goods to the complex pattern of a whole town. And so what he's saying back in the 1940s, design is very much a product, it's not a process, okay? And it's something that is experienced functionally, and it has shape and form and aesthetic. Jump to the 1960s. Herbert Simon says, design is devising courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So here we start to see design actually move from just about a product, just about something physical, just about something you interact with, and maybe it's a process, and maybe it's a process that leads to a change in something physical or manifest. Okay, jump a couple years ahead to 1971, Victor Papanek. He says design is a conscious and intuitive effort to impose meaningful order. So Papanek is really someone who began to speak of design in ethical terms, in terms of philosophy and epistemology, and in these other more esoteric ways, where it's not just about the physical environment or a product or your clothes, but it's really about how you interact and engage and respond to your environment, and that you could actually design for that. The field of semiotics, right, and understanding meaning and what symbols mean, or what the table means, right? Those are all things that design began to incorporate. Phenomenology, again, is one of those things. So, just jump to today, 2016, Jessica Helfand again. She says, design is to make things knowable. Right, so we've seen that over the course from 1940s all the way to present day, that design is evolved from something that's just very much where you had architects and product designers, to design being something that's, design is actually a process. It's a way of understanding the world. It's a way of interacting and engaging with other people. You can design experiences. You can design completely intangible things. The whole realm of experience design is huge right now. I spent 2 years working in hospitals, helping hospitals design good experiences, right? And I'm not an architect. I don't design anything physical. Give me Photoshop, I don't even know where to start with it, okay? So, what is human-centered design then? We've talked about design, but what is human-centered design? Renowned design theorist Richard Buchanan says that human-centered design is fundamentally an affirmation of human dignity. It's an ongoing search for what can be done to support and strengthen the dignity of human beings as they act out their lives in varied social, economic, political, and cultural circumstances. Now here's what's interesting. Notice the word political. Notice that it's embedded in a string of other words. And what I want to pull from this is the idea that politics or political or policy is contextual, that it exists with adjacency alongside society and economics and cultural circumstances, that these things are all influencers of policy, and that policy doesn't exist in a silo outside of these things, it exists in the context of these things, okay? So, I think that's just important to note. And so coming back to our question, now that we've explored design, how is justice designed? I think it's interesting to think about maybe this question we need to be asking more, because again, I'm not an expert in policy, but my sense of being in the mayor's office for the last year and in my very limited knowledge of how ideas are turned into policy is that this process hasn't changed a lot in government over the course of the last 50 years possibly, but that society and culture and technology and human behavior even in a lot of ways has shifted quite a bit. And so maybe by asking this question, how is justice designed, we can create more space to incorporate this contextuality, more space to incorporate this idea that policy exists in the context of society and culture and other spaces. And what's interesting about design too is that design is now, as it's, it started as a practice, as an outcome, and it evolved into something that's more of a philosophy, more of a worldview, more of a way of even interpreting reality. And so it's a discipline now, and it's a practice as much as it is a theory of everything, in the sense that there's space to incorporate other types of practice. So whether it's policy making or whether it's qualitative research, which we're going to get to in a second, or whether it's art, or whether it's teaching and education. Okay, so how do we design justice? I'm going to give you a few answers based on what we just read in terms of the definition of design. I think we design justice by making intentional decisions that affirm human dignity. I think that we design justice by changing existing situations into ones that affirm human dignity, by imposing a meaningful order that affirms human dignity. Actually, I want to back up just a little bit. Let's go to making intentional decisions. No, this one. Think about the way that police interact with black men in our country right now. It's a really hot topic, right? It's very heated. Think about the Black Lives Movement. Now think about changing existing situations into ones that affirm human dignity. Now, if the conversation was about this and about human dignity, do you think that the conversation would that help at all? Would that shift and change and inform the dialogue around how police should be treating human beings in our society, in our country today, right? If policy that governed the way police interact was designed and built and written in response to this question, would that change something? Would that help, right? So this is why these questions, I think, are helpful. I just wanted to share that as an example. Okay. And finally, we design justice by making the things that affirm human dignity knowable. Okay, so now I want to actually get to human-centered design. That was more of the theory. I want to touch very, very briefly on the actual practice. Now this is going to be super high level. We're not going to be able to go into depth too much, but at the end I'll share a case study with you as well, some of our work and what we've done in the mayor's office and how this actually translates. So consider this is part 2 now. Here we get to the more practical side of things. Human-centered design. I think about the acronym HCD. 3 big phases of human-centered design. We're going to talk about the methodology. Hear, create, deliver. So I'm going to talk through these 3 big phases briefly. So hear. So fundamental to this work of human-centered design is empathy. Many, in fact, I would say all human design theorists and practitioners would agree that without empathy, you can't actually do human-centered anything. And so fundamentally, you have to start here. You have to start with this idea of empathy. And the way that you develop and cultivate empathy is actually by listening to the stories of real people, discerning their needs, their barriers, their constraints, their aspirations, their values, their goals. That's how you actually begin to empathize with somebody, is by seeing the world through their eyes and understanding what it is like to walk in their shoes. Now, can you do this sitting at your desk in City Hall? No, you can't. You actually have to get out. You actually have to be in the community. You actually have to be talking to the people that you are serving. You need to be asking them to tell you their stories. You need to be listening and hearing what it is that they're telling you in terms of their pain and their trial and their struggle and what the things that are they want fixed, right? This is also this is a big issue that I've seen, is that often government doesn't necessarily embrace the credibility of the community voice. And so the job of a designer is to advocate, in design parlance we call it the end user. So the job of the designer is to advocate for that person in the community. The job of the designer is the person to say, the voice of the community, this person right here, like their voice is credible because they know their problem better than you can know their problem. So listen, and let's allow them to speak into and shape the solution that we're developing. All right, now one of the ways that we can do this, and I would encourage you to go look this up. In fact, there's Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot is a Harvard professor who developed this qualitative research method called portraiture, and it's rooted in ethnography. And so ethnographic portraiture is one of my favorite methods in terms of practicing ethnographic qualitative research and collecting these stories. So I highly suggest you buy her book she wrote in the late 90s. She's really profound. I think you'll really get a lot out of it. She says, that portraiture seeks to unveil the universal truths and resonant stories that lie in the specifics and complexity of everyday life. And so this is really about gleaning that insight, gleaning those barriers, those values, those constraints from your end user, from the people who you're writing policy for, the people that you're trying to help. Okay? And again, it requires being in the community, it requires listening. There's a lot of tools online for this. There's everything. Everyone has a cell phone in their pocket, in your pocket. With a cell phone, you have a smartphone that has a voice recorder, it has a video camera, has everything that you need to do really good qualitative research. You can take notes. You don't really need anything other than that. Okay, number 2. So we talked about hearing. You need to hear, you need to listen. Create. So moving from stories to strategies and from inspiration to ideas. That's what creating is about. So you've collected stories, you've collected those insights. In design practice, we call this affinity mapping, where, I'm sure you've seen pictures of sticky notes all over the wall. Anyone seen those pictures, right? So that's often what's happening there, is that people are writing down insights, they're writing down quotes, they're writing down things that they've heard through qualitative research. And they might even begin to bring quantitative research into that at that point, and facts and figures and so on and so forth, survey results. And they're starting to do what they call affinity mapping. And affinity mapping is beginning to identify those themes and those threads that you identify as something to act on, right? So now you can take those stories and actually begin to develop strategies, because what will come out of the stories, out of the real life experience of the people whom you're designing for, will be strategies. So you do that synthesis. This is very heavy on synthesis. And you'll be inspired. Listening to other people's real stories is very inspiring, and often ideas and those gold nuggets come out of those stories. So key activities in creating, this is really heavy on synthesis, taking all of that insight, that research. Also, another thing that I didn't include in here, but I was told by another policy student that is very helpful, is this idea of divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Anyone familiar with this? Okay, so a few of us. So I would write that down, Google that later, look at those diagrams, this model developed by the British Design Council. Divergent thinking is this idea of going very broad, right? Going for quantity over quality. You're thinking for all the sources of information and ideas that I can possibly get. That's divergent. Some people call it flaring. And then you converge. You bring that all back together. You synthesize. You do the affinity mapping. You think through those themes, right? And that's some people call focusing. Flare focus. Okay, that's synthesis. Brainstorming, prototyping, and feedback. So what you're doing is you're brainstorming ideas. You're thinking about, we call this often ideation, right? Where you should be doing this work with your end user, with people in the community. Finally, deliver. Okay, so delivery is really about moving your ideas towards implementation. So once you've done the listening and the hearing, once you've done the synthesis and the brainstorming and a bit of prototyping, prototyping is different than piloting. I think this is actually another problem that I've discovered in government, and it's really a semantic issue. Prototyping is low fidelity, and typically it's done really quick. It's something that is iterative, it's a very iterative process, whereas piloting is a much higher fidelity, usually higher cost, and it's done a bit over time, okay? Those are two very different things. Often in government, when a designer says, let's prototype something, they think pilot, and they're like, oh no, we need to go now find $100,000, and we need to pilot this program, and then we need to hire researchers who can measure outcomes, and it's like, no, that's a totally different thing than prototyping. So again, I would encourage you to, actually, I've got some resources for you as well at the end. I'll share that you can learn more about prototyping. So once you've prototyped, you found an idea like this really works. We've shared it with our end users, the people who we're designing for. They love this idea. We're going to move this forward to implementation. And again, this is really about the iterative process. So prototyping, another way to think of prototyping is building to think. And it's all about learning. So failure is awesome, embrace it, because it means you're learning something. If you prototype something and learn from it, if it fails, you can learn and make it better. So do this. This is iterative. You guys are familiar with like agile project management? Same thing, very iterative. We don't want waterfall project management here where we go launch a $100 million thing and then it fails. That's government technology. Okay, low cost ways, trying out your idea. This is really iterative, as I said, and this is where you begin tracking indicators and outcomes. So that's a high level overview of HCD, of human-centered design. hear, create, deliver. Okay, so again, I'll have some resources for you guys can dive more into that. But because we're getting short on time, I want to share this case study with you. So in the first year that our team started working for the mayor, our team, we're a multidisciplinary team. Half of us have private sector backgrounds, and really we kind of act as internal consultants to the mayor, and our job is to bring outside thinking and innovative practices into government. And we like to say that we are productive disruptors, right? That we want to kind of interrupt and disrupt the status quo, but in a productive manner that's actually not confrontational necessarily, but conducive to helping folks in government learn new practice. And so one of the things that, the big thing that the mayor asked us to focus on last year, and this is because this is a very important issue for the mayor, is this idea of issuing disparities for young black men in the city of Seattle. I'm sure you're familiar with the disparities, but it's in terms of education, in terms of the justice system, in terms of employment and jobs. The disparities are rampant, and so the mayor asked us to spend our first year in Seattle looking at these issues, looking at the research that's been done already, but also just going out into the community and better understanding these stories. And so we spent our first year addressing these disparities, and we spent time with almost 70 young black men, ages 13 to 24 in Seattle. We just spent time playing basketball, hanging out in community centers, walking the street, hanging out in all kinds of different places, coffee shops. We did some focus groups on some schools. We did a bunch of work. So we spent a lot of time, we spent months just hanging out with these guys, guys who had just come out of prison, guys who were straight A students, and stars on the football teams, and everyone in between. And it was actually one of the most coolest things I've ever had the opportunity to just go hang out with guys for months on it. It was awesome. So if you can get into qualitative research gigs, that's the benefit. So we spent a lot of time with these folks. We also spent a lot of time talking with teachers, probation officers, outreach workers, parents, grandparents. We talked to a bunch of folks, really trying to understand these issues. And so in our conversations with these young men, we discovered that this idea of hope was the defining trait for those who had changed the course of their life. So this idea of hope was really the differentiator. And this was really interesting to us. And hope is something that wouldn't necessarily ever come up in a survey or any other governmental program. We don't have hope programs that we're funding in the mayor's office. But it struck us, and it continued to come up in every single conversation that we had. The idea of hope came up. And it really rung true when one young man asked us, he said, "Is hope a privilege reserved only for the affluent?" Like, man, it's so crazy that you would have to even ask that, right? And again, too, we're thinking about human dignity, and is hope connected to human dignity, and is hope a characteristic of human dignity? And if you have dignity as a human, do you have hope? So we started to investigate this, and after, again, many conversations, we discovered that hope was two things. Number one, hope was the vision for a bright future. This is one of two things. Secondly, the belief that that future was attainable. And what we discovered that if you only had one of those things, you weren't very hopeful. But if you had both of those things, you were actually very hopeful. And so we began to ask this question, and the mayor asked us to focus really intentionally on 18 to 24-year-old young men who are often marginalized. And so we began to ask this question of, what if every young man, 18 to 24, young black male in Seattle, had a vision for a bright future and the belief that that was attainable? And this idea of having the vision and having the belief, right, these two core components. So again, we continued to investigate this, and we discovered that really vision, how do young men get vision? And it really came down to exposure. It really came down to this idea that I was exposed to something. So I have a vision for being a producer, a music producer. And the reason I have that vision is because a mentor of mine said, "Hey, I know this producer, and he's going to be doing some. He's actually working with Macklemore on something. You want to come hang out and see what they're doing?" He said, "Yeah, I'll go check it out." So he went and hung out, saw the studio space, was like, I want to be a producer. This is it. This is amazing, right? So it really came down to exposure. Secondly, belief is about mindset. Belief is about, I believe that I can do that, right? It's a state of mind. It's a sense of self-confidence and an understanding of, I know how to bridge the gap. I know how to get there. And what's really interesting about both vision and belief is that both are relational. Because belief was often the result of a mentor, somebody in my life who believed in me first, and then I began to believe in myself. So not only was I exposed through a relationship, but that belief that I could actually attain what I was exposed to also came through a relationship. And so we put this phrase together. This is like very jargony. I apologize for how jargony this is, but it says we want to catalyze vision and belief by operationalizing social capital in the tech sector. So, quick note, the reason that we were focusing on social capital and the tech sector is because these are both subjects that have been floating around city government and our Office of Economic Development. I don't know if you've heard, we just won a big $2 million grant for a program called Tech Hire, which is all about getting young people into technology jobs. And so we were focusing on tech sector as a means of plugging our work into the existing work of government. So we developed this program called the Career Exploration and Mentoring. And really this is about making it experientially rooted, relationally focused job mentoring. And this came out of, and this idea was born out of this nugget of hope, and trying to figure out what hope was and what role did hope play. And in doing so, we began to share this idea with young men, and they loved it. And they're asking us, like, when can we do this? When can we sign up for this program? And so experientially rooted, this is really, we designed it to be 5 immersive excursions to local technology companies where as a cohort with a mentor, you would be taken and think about like you guys remember Bat Kid in San Francisco? Do you remember that story? Right? So the McDonald Foundation or Make-A-Wish, the Make-A-Wish Foundation. So this young boy, I think he was like 5 or 6 years old, he wanted to be Batman. And so for a day, the Make-A-Wish Foundation created this experience for him in San Francisco that allowed him to really fulfill that dream of being Batman, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about. We're not talking about a tour through a corporate campus. There's the coffee, there's a desk and a screen, over there's the HR department, over here, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an experience where you get to go into a technology company and you get a door pass for the day. They greet you by your name at reception. You get a computer to use. You get to actually work on a product. You get to meet people and understand and work with those people and develop a relationship with those people. So for a day, you actually get to be immersed in that environment like you belong there, right? Relationally focused. So again, this is a lot of emphasis in this program about fostering relationships between young men, their peers, mentors, other working professionals in affinity groups. And again, it's a job mentoring program in that we're really trying to close that savviness gap for young men who are coming out of gangs, maybe haven't even graduated high school, right? Can we equip them to navigate these soft systems and really leveraging relationships to do so. Okay. 5 weekly mentor-led workshops. Okay, so outcomes. If we can catalyze vision and belief, we can enable young men to take on life's opportunities. So this is really coming back to that challenge statement that we wanted to achieve. We thought, you know what, these are all hypotheses at this point. If we could possibly increase diversity in the technology sector by building these relationships. We can increase income and economic mobility, reduce racial wage inequality, and expose employers to a new talent market. Now, briefly touch on some of this process of hear, create, and deliver. And one of the big things that I wanted to emphasize is how critical it is to test your ideas early. And so this is what we did. We actually partnered with Microsoft really early on. We found a group of, I think it was 11 or 12 young men between the ages of 18 and 24. And we designed a one-day immersive experience built on this model of relationships and social capital, exposing them to an experience and instilling in them the belief that they could actually work at Microsoft. So we went to Microsoft and we did a bunch of relationship stuff. We got time where a bunch of men There's an affinity group at Microsoft called Blacks at Microsoft. Professional black men who came and actually spent time with these young men, told them their stories, told them how they got there, told them the hurdles that they have to face, the unique challenges of being a black man in that environment. And they got time to just hang out and talk. Lots of exposure. We went to, so this is, they actually walked us through a bunch of their facilities that aren't actually public, and that typically they would, make you sign an NDA that says they're going to kill you if you tell anyone about it. But anyway, so we got to see some really cool stuff that was pretty amazing, including some technology that hasn't been announced yet. So we did this prototype, well, not a pilot. We did this prototype, and it was actually super successful. We got this email back from one of the participants. He said, "My time with the Microsoft Career Exploration was one of the most beneficial experiences that I've ever experienced. So thank you for everything. I truly learned a lot and had an amazing time." So this was the feedback that we got from the young men. And this number, 30 to 100%, this is the percentage of participants who, coming in that morning to this prototype, who reported, 30% reported they knew somebody who did something they would want to do in the future as a career. At the end of the day, 100%, they said, yep, we all now know somebody that is doing something that we could see ourselves doing. So, obviously, that's a very small N. It's only 11 young men, but now we're looking to do a larger pilot. So now we've developed and co-designed and co-created this program with young men. We've prototyped it and validated the idea and got really positive feedback. So now we can take this and begin to scale it. So think now, coming back to policy and how this relates to policy. The city of Seattle invests millions and millions of dollars every year in job training programs. Millions of dollars in hard skills education. We don't invest anything in soft skills education when it comes to job training. Now, we do invest a lot in the arts and other areas that translate the soft skills. But the way that this can begin to relate to policy and the work that we've done in creating this program is now when we go back to rewrite all of our contracts with the service providers who are doing this, we can now overlay all of our hard skills training programs with this as an innate function of the program. So it's now a required outcome. It could become a required outcome that you're doing social capital training, that you're teaching young men not only how to code, but you're teaching them how to introduce themselves, how to write a resume, how to use LinkedIn, how to go to a meetup, how to email somebody they've never talked to before, right? Those are all things that we often take for granted. But those things are an advantage to us in our ability to navigate these soft systems and use relationships to climb the economic ladder. So that's a very high level of the work that we're doing on my team in the mayor's office. It's a very high level overview of human-centered design. I created this page today with some more resources, just my website /SeattleU. If you go to that URL, there's some resources there for you to dive deeper. There's some books that I've listed, as well as some online resources. Lots of really great resources.